built my own career in that general area. So I've been familiar with the work of tonight's speaker for more years than I will mention. I've got several of his volumes in my own library here in the office and another couple back home. So this is really a special pleasure. And I also had the privilege of meeting him and hearing him in Washington, D.C. Now that's all I'm going to say. So on this note, there is a special treat, because instead of me handing over to the student who's going to introduce our speaker, I'm actually going to have another step. I want to introduce one of my colleagues. One of our colleagues who's joined us this year, is his first year with us as part of our ongoing expansion here at Georgetown, Dr. Abdallah Al-Aryan, who is a professor of Middle East history, specializing, amongst other things, on Egypt and Islamist movements and so on. So Dr. Aryan is going to introduce our student, and he will later act as moderator as well.
Good evening, everyone. I think I will also be cheating a little bit. Before we bring up our student speaker who will introduce Dr. Voll, I did want to just make a couple of remarks. I think I qualify as Dr. Voll's student as well, so technically it will be also introduced by a student. It's hard to believe that it's been 10 years this fall when I began my graduate work at Georgetown in Washington, and Dr. Voll, of course, became my mentor at the time and really was at the foundation of my entire intellectual formation. And as I try to remind my students sometimes, if I ever have said anything insightful in class, you probably have Dr. Voll to thank for that. I've learned so much from him over the years, and it's really such a pleasure that he's been taking time out of his own schedule to appear in our Islamic Movements course here in Doha this semester via the RPX technology that we have, where he kind of comes in very early on Wednesday mornings while we're here late in the afternoons, and it's been such a treat, I think, for our students to be able to learn from him, especially this being his final semester in teaching. He's due to retire at the end of this academic year, and so I think we're so fortunate to have him with us here just before he goes into retirement. And I will say that as far as today's lecture and really a lot of the talks and his work and his publications are concerned, that it's really been so important to be able to listen to the kind of perspective that he brings, because although they touch on so many issues that are so directly involved in the things that many of us here are interested in, things that have to do with Islam in the modern period, and specifically the way that it interacts with the current political situations that we're seeing unfolding around us. But he has such a way about him in terms of being able to really broaden these kinds of conversations to things that we don't necessarily think about immediately when we're just reading the news or speaking about these things in a very kind of immediate sense. And with that, I think I speak for everyone here to say we're really looking forward to his talk here this evening, and certainly looking forward to the discussion afterwards. We will have some time, hopefully, to take some of your questions at the very end, and so do think about those as you're listening to the talk. And with that, I will bring up Jannah Al-Awkar, who is a student in the Islamic Movements course. She's a junior here at Georgetown, and will be introducing Dr. Voll. Thank you.
Good evening. Dr. John Voll is a professor of Islamic history and past associate director of Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. He taught Middle Eastern, Islamic, and world history at the University of New Hampshire for 30 years before moving to Georgetown University in 1995. He graduated from Dartmouth College and received his PhD degree from Harvard University. He has lived in Cairo, Beirut, and Sudan, and has traveled widely in the Muslim world. Second edition of his book, Islam, Continuity and Change in the Modern World, appeared in 1994. He is co-author with John Esposito of Islam and Democracy and Makers of Contemporary Islam, and is editor, author, or co-author of 7 additional books. He is a past president of Middle East Studies Association and also of the New England Historical Association. He has served on the boards of directors of the American Council of Learned Societies, the New Hampshire Humanities Council, the New Hampshire Council on World Affairs, the Sudan Studies Association, and the World History Association. He was the chair of the program committee for the 1999 annual meeting of the American Historical Association. In 1991, he received an Egyptian Presidential Medal in recognition for scholarship on Islam. He has published numerous articles and book chapters on modern Islamic and Sudanese history. Thank you.
I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say. Thank you so much for the kind introductions, and it is a real pleasure to be here in the other part of Georgetown. And as Abdullah said, I have been, what do we call it, virtually here for a class, and I look forward to virtual and other physical presences here in the future. I really want, though, to share with you, given what was said in the introduction, that was a good reminder in the abstract that I am not a diplomat, I am not a businessman, I am an academic, and I enjoy being an academic. And not only that, but in contrast to the dean, who wouldn't mention how many years, and to Abdullah, who mentioned 10 years, I want to talk about my experience, but my experience on the basis of when I started as a graduate student, and that was more than 50 years ago. I first went to Cairo as a graduate student in 1960, so that I was able to participate in Tahrir Square in demonstrations shouting the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now, I want to just say that because what I have as the subtitle for my talk, Religion in the 21st Century Global Affairs. Why is religion still around? That sub-question is probably almost meaningless to most people in this room. Because religion in 21st century global affairs, you know what I'm going to say. Gee, in the 21st century, religion is really important. You have to know religion, you have to study religion, and all of that sort of thing. When I was a graduate student in the newly created Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard, that was not an automatic position. In fact, and this came a little bit later even, there was a major sociologist of religion by the name of Peter Berger, who in 1968 was quoted in the New York Times. And I want to read his comments on 21st century religion for the moment. Now this, remember, is 1968. By the 21st century, that's us now, by the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. Now, one of the fun games that I play is, Google is such a temptation for everything. But one of the fun games to play is to look at how many people in the 1960s promised us that religion was going to disappear. And of course, it didn't. And so what I want us to think about, what I want us to speculate about a little bit, is this question, why is religion still around? Now let me affirm for a moment. See if I can make, oh, look at that. Yeah, the machine works, great. The secular 21st century, and just a couple of images from recent times. This was just a week and a half or so ago. President Obama and Pope Francis. Or a little bit longer ago, but during the last election in, you notice, Obama is thinking about the elections in 2014, and somebody who was also thinking about presidential elections a few years ago, Vladimir Putin and the Patriarch. The Patriarch, Carol, is important in the emerging articulation of the national feeling of identity in Russia. I mean, think for a moment, looking at this picture, think for a moment of whether or not you would think this is possible. Would a picture like this have been possible with the first leader of the Soviet Union, Lenin? Can you imagine Lenin hugging the Patriarch and depending on the Patriarch? No, I can't, at least. I can sort of imagine Franklin Roosevelt, and long-term American president from the first half of the 20th century, maybe having a fireside chat with the then Pope Pius or something like that. But it wouldn't be this. It wouldn't be a meeting in which these two were comparing their programs for the global future of the world in terms of economic justice and economic equality and so on. And so we end up then with, and I don't like texts in PowerPoint, but this breaks all of my rules, and I'm going to do it because it was really important in terms of the kind of point that I want to make. Some of you may have in your courses had to read articles in the American policy establishment journal called Foreign Affairs. Foreign Affairs is not known for advocacy of religion. A couple years ago, the first feature article was an article by Scott Thomas. And as you look around the world, from the southern United States to the Middle East, religion is on the rise. The religious resurgence is not simply defined by the growth of fundamentalism, rigid adherence, but is occurring through a variety of renewed rituals and practices, both in public and private. Now again, just, you know, it's nice to be old, and I love being old. And you know, I can do what old guys are supposed to do then. I can say, oh boy, when I was a kid, things were really different. But this is unthinkably different from what I was trained in my Middle Eastern studies. And so I want us to think a little bit more. We can do lots of proof texting of the fact that religion is now important and that religion wasn't important a long time ago. Or people didn't think it was going to be important. But what I'd like to do is just sort of make some suggestions about answering the question of why is religion still around. Now, the other time I was at Georgetown University in Qatar was during a conference a number of years ago, and I had a very interesting conversation with one of the 20th century's major Muslim intellectuals, Muhammad Arkoun. And I was making a distinction that Muhammad Arkoun simply refused to accept. And it was something that I think is worthwhile just thinking about for a moment in terms of the point. I was arguing that even fundamentalism, as we know it, is a modern concept. It's a modern structure. It's a modern organization. Now, Muhammad Arkoun wasn't willing to accept the idea that the Muslim Brotherhood was modern, or that Al-Qaeda was modern, because he would not make a distinction between modernist, that is, people who were consciously trying to create a modern articulation of religion. He was unwilling to distinguish that from people who were organized in religious ways. But as we look, a first kind of setting for my answer to that question of why is religion still around, I want to argue just briefly and do it visually. Again, Google is such a trap. There are so many lovely pictures out there. Most of you probably don't know, but in the 1920s in the United States, there was a major intellectual battle over creationism. Still is a major battle over creationism, but in the 1920s there was a major battle, and a school teacher was put on trial. A school teacher by the name of Scopes was put on trial for teaching evolution in schools. And there was a great debate between the two great voices of scientific evolutionary modernism, Darrow, and of creationism interpreted as a fundamentalist by William Jennings Bryan. Now this is Darrow and Bryan. And I have this picture because if you look at it, if I were to ask you, okay, identify the anti-modern, identify the person in the picture who is the anti-modern fundamentalist. And it would be very difficult because they both look the same. They're both wearing suspenders. In the 1920s, a lot of people wore suspenders. They're both wearing suspenders. They're both wearing shirts. They both have eyeglasses. They both have modern haircuts. Neither of them have beards, and so on. There's no way of telling the difference unless you hear what they're talking about. And that is because in terms of methodology, and thought they might be different, but in terms of their mode of expression, they were both modern. Now, I can and will give sort of examples, but because most of my studies have been in terms of modern movements in the Muslim world, most of my examples will be Islamic. But if we look, the most famous fundamentalist movement, I think, in the contemporary world today is the Muslim Brotherhood. And if we look at then who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, the visual image is very interesting. This is a widely published picture of Hassan al-Banna, the person who founded the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, you'll notice he has a coat and tie. He doesn't have a robe. He's wearing a fez, and if you know your Middle Eastern history, you know that the fez was introduced by a westernizing modernizer for official wear. He, in other words, is maybe fundamentalist in his approach, but in his mode of presentation, in his visual mode of presentation, he is modern. Now, he is not a modernist. He is a fundamentalist modern. And again, I had this whole little library of modern fundamentalists. And as you look at a picture, Sayyid Qutb, the best known of the radical jihadist ideologues and so on, he's almost always in a coat and tie. He doesn't have a big furry beard. He does not look like the standard stereotype of the extremist fundamentalist. And so, I'm sorry, you'll notice we've got very good technicians who can tell the difference when I'm going to stand there for a while, and so I will try not to wander back and forth. But I want then, not in addition to the fundamentalist moderns, there are modernist moderns, people who try and bring together modern conditions and modern approaches with a modern theology. And two of the major movements of this sort are in Indonesia. One is called the Muhammadiya, which is probably the second largest Islamic organization in the world. It was founded in the beginning of the 20th century by somebody who went to Mecca and who discovered the teachings of the Islamic modernist teacher from Egypt, Muhammad Abdu, and came back and established then a modernist organization. Now, I've gotten fixated with visual images, but this guy, sure, he has a turban, but that's not a traditional Indonesian or Javanese turban. It's a new thing that he learned. He is dressed differently, and he produced then an organization that was modernist. Similarly, what is probably the largest Islamic organization in the world, single within a country, the Nahdlatul Ulama. You have the Nahdlatul Ulama, and this is Hashim Ashari. I didn't save my PowerPoint properly, and so you don't get his name. But again, look, and again, he is not dressed like a traditional scholar of Islam who was living in Indonesia. Now, their descendants in leadership are worth looking at for a moment, because the point that I want to try and make is this point that even within something like modernism, 20th century religious organizations have a different tone and mode than 21st century. Let's go back, give you these two images again for a minute, see if I can get ourselves to go back. Dahlan and Ashari. Now, the next two leaders, these are people who in the 1990s were the heads of those two organizations. Again, these guys aren't dressed at all like even their leadership ancestors. This is Amin Rais, who was the head of the Muhammadiya, and who was then resigned from that to become the Speaker of Parliament. This is Gastur, this is Abdurrahman Wahid. Again, one would be hard-pressed, especially, again, headgear, especially since they're wearing the nationalist hat of Java in Indonesia, the hat that was made popular by the nationalist secularizing leader Sukarno. This is a different mode, this is a different expression. And so we have then a kind of a picture that I want us to think about for a moment. Now let me give you a couple more visual images as we're looking at the differences between 20th century Islam, 20th century Muslim movements, and the 21st century. Now before I do that, I said 20th century Islam and 21st century Islam. I want to make it clear, I am not talking about changes in eternally true doctrines. There are eternal truth. My faith says there are eternal truths that are unchanging. And I want to make that, I'm not talking about how unchanging truths changed. Instead, what I am looking at is how individual human beings and groups of human beings in different ages express their understanding of those eternal truths within the modes and formats of the time in which they lived. And so we have in the late 20th century some interesting transformations of what I like to call the popular religion into the pop star religion. And one of the early people to make this kind of transition in Egypt, you had a number of sheikhs who were like Sheikh Sha'rawi and Sheikh Kishk, who discovered television and who became pop stars, but within a relatively traditional mode. Now I had to decide, since I'm in Qatar, that the best example, when I show a picture, the best example of this transformation is here in Qatar, or sometimes here in Qatar. I think he travels a lot. And that is, of course, Yusuf Qaradawi. Yusuf Qaradawi was starting his education a little bit before I did, but not much. He was doing his learning in Al-Azhar in Cairo while I was there. We never met, unfortunately. But you have a transformation then of somebody who was expressing unchanging truths, but in new idioms. And I opted not for showing a picture of him because I wanted to do the purest 21st century mode. And just think visually for a moment what, even the transformation, even the difference, this, I think, is 20th century pop modern. This is, for better or for worse, 20th century, not 20th century, 21st century pop modern. And we have these transformations. Well, now the question then becomes, and I want to make sure that I leave time for us to have some discussion. The question then becomes then, how does this take place? What are the dynamics that are involved here? How does religion survive? And of course, the first kind of conceptual answer is it all depends on how you define religion. And so we can accept that. The second that we can all accept is that, maybe God is right. And that religion survives because religion is belief in God, and as long as God exists, that maybe that's a perfectly good explanation. But I'll do a little more sociological approach. I mean, there are people who argue, quite correctly, that secular, non-religious, modern religion pretty much has failed. And so that you have a religion that continues, but it takes a different form from the secular religion of the 20th century. Going back to the 1960s, if you read Harvey Cox's The Secular City, which was a classic definition of the problems religion is going to have in modern society. And the revival of religion is that the alternative religions failed. Modern secularism failed, and that's one kind of explanation that you see out there. A second is that in the context of globalization, how people self-identify for being motivated for action has changed. I've done some work on Islam and the history of Muslims in Nigeria, for example, and I find it really interesting that when I first studied, well, actually I had the opportunity, again, the way the world has changed. As a graduate student, I could hitchhike any place I wanted to. And so I hitchhiked from Kano to Khartoum in Africa, and there weren't any civil wars, and there weren't any problems, and I could just go where I wanted to, and so on. But in Nigeria in those days, when there were clashes among peoples, they were called tribal clashes. And so in the Central Plateau, it was different tribes that were fighting each other. In the 21st century, those same people are fighting each other over land and stuff like that, but now, rather than being identified as tribal conflicts, they're identified as religious conflicts. In the old days, it was Fulani and so on. Today, it is Muslims and Christians. And that's the self-identification as well as the identification of the people, the observers. And so that part of it is that religious identity has become more important under certain kind of contexts, those contexts that get the headlines, for example, than the old ethnic conflicts. I mean, as you look, for example, today in the peninsula, I think there was a little short note on asking Iran, the Yemeni president asking Iran to stop helping revolutionaries. And in the old days, the Houthis up north were tribal. Today, they're all Shiites in terms of the coverage, so that identity has changed. But I'd like to sort of close with, I think I can close in 5 minutes and give us 15 or 20 to talk, because this is the part where I really want reaction. One of the standard glad-handing academic critiques of academia, of how people approach the problems of modernity and so on, is that people will say religion survived because modernization theory was wrong. And you get, I've done it, that you look at the great fluorescence of religion, the religious resurgence, both intellectually and in violence and militant movements, and people saying, ha ha ha, all of those dumb people in the 1960s were wrong. And it's interesting, even Berger, who wrote in the 21st century, Religion Will Disappear, he edited a volume and wrote in the introduction, secularization theory was wrong. And I admit that I was wrong. Everybody made a mistake. Religion could survive. But I would suggest that the traditional modernization theory is not secularization theory. That secularization theory gets tied to modernization. Secularization is seen as a part of modernization. But if you look at the old texts, being textual, being Orientalist or whatever, let's look at the text. And Edward Said looked at the texts of people who were studying religion. I like to look at the texts of people who were studying modernization and economic development and so on. If you look at the two, probably the two for Middle Eastern studies, the two most influential modernization theory books were Gene Rostow's The Stages of Economic Growth and Daniel Lerner's The Passing of Traditional Society. Passing of Traditional Society says it right in the title. What Rostow and Lerner and the modernization theorists of the 1960s were saying was that traditional society is going to disappear. And traditional religion, as a part of traditional society, will then disappear. But they weren't talking about the end of religion. They were talking about the transformation of traditional society. And it becomes clear as one looks in Lerner's book. There's a phrase that Lerner used that is very often quoted by the people who like to say, modernization theory was wrong. And that is the phrase of having to choose between Mecca and mechanization. Nifty phrase, it just sits right there. But the top policy, this is 1958, the top policy problem for 3 generations of Middle Eastern leaders has been, now listen, has been whether one must choose between Mecca and mechanization, or whether one can make them compatible. What Lerner was arguing was that the question was not the disappearance of faith in Islam, but rather the stakes are nothing less than the meaning of Islam itself. Both modernizers and traditionalists wish to reorganize secular life within Islam. The question is, which Islam? Not Islam or no Islam. And modernization theory then is built on this idea that traditional society will be transformed by modernization, and all of those practices that one thinks about, practices now, not theology, all of those practices that one thinks about that are associated with traditional society will in some way kind of disappear. Get in your car, get on your motorbike, put your shoes on, and just walk around Doha. How much traditional society can you find? Not how much traditional society revived with nice fancy little tents and things like that, but real old-fashioned traditional society. The picture that I couldn't find, and I did need to send this earlier, was a picture from my graduate student days and then present. And that is when I was working in the Sudan, there was a lovely old tomb of a saint, Badr al-Ubaid, which was about 30 kilometers outside of Khartoum North. Now, when I was there in the 60s, al-Ubaid's tomb was a simply little dome in a dusty flat area with a little hut next door to it in a small village. That's from the 19th century. In the 1970s, this great-great-grandson of Badr al-Obaid discovered cash farming and discovered that he had all of these people who were loyal to the memory of his ancestor. And so he created then a cash farm economy for this little rural society. And when I was back in Sudan in 2005, I went and visited. Now it's a huge place. There's a surface road. There's an asphalt road to Khartoum North. For Friday prayers, there are usually 3,000 to 5,000 people there. There's a school, there's a medical clinic, and so on. That clearly, modernization clearly brought an end to not the memory of Badr al-Obaid, but the way that he gets honored. He got honored in the 21st century mode. Well, I just want to close. See now, where have I hidden my clicker? Did I put it in my pocket? Anybody see my clicker? Ah, here it is. I just want to close with some. This is really the end of traditional society. This is Omar Mukhtar, who was the leader of the Senussia resistance to the Italian imperial conquest in the first half of the 20th century. And this, in a way, is modernization at its worst, destroying traditional society. But really, last sort of thing, difference between 20th and 21st century modes of expression, of activism in the public square and so on. My favorite contrast picture is, this is a famous picture of women participating in the 1919 revolution in Egypt. This is women in the same square participating in the 2011. Now, we could spend the next hour. I mean, if we were in class, Abdullah knows, if we were in class, what I would do is I would make you discuss what you see as the differences and what are the significance of the differences, because in many ways these are the same, but in many ways they are different. And religion has survived in the 20th century by being able to make this kind of transformation, by being able to find modes for expressing the eternal, unchanging truths in ways that are meaningful to the social and political and cultural context of the time in which people live. Well, I think we've got some time for questions. I'll turn it over to Abdullah. Thank you very much for listening.